Would you like to come out today? Oh, yes, please, said Edward. So they lit his fire, made lots of steam, and Edward puffed away.
Hello, everyone. That's right, AU Facts is making its grand return. Season 3 is here. Well, on its way. You know what I mean. Let's get into it. Fact 1. Fearless Freddy pulls an express service on the Skarloey called the Mountain Rambler. The service collects passengers from Gordon's Express and then heads up the line non-stop to Gleeloy. A bus owned by the railway then takes the passengers to the Colby Fell. The bus is named Ranger, and she's good friends with the railway engines in Madge. Fact 2. Just north of Peel Gawdred is an oil field, owned by Sodor Oils Limited. Here, oil is extracted, and then sent by railway to fuel depots, harbors, or wherever else is needed. Area Bert used to shunt here when the ironworks only needed one engine, as they were less likely to produce sparks compared to the steam engines that run the branch. Nowadays, the oil fields have their own engine, but that's another story. 2 engines are rostered on longer oil trains for more braking power, as oil is heavy and not something you want on a runaway train. This also applies to petrol and diesel trains going over Gordon's Hill. After all,
it's fuel, and it's dangerous.
Fact 3. After Percy's incident with the chocolate factory, he crashed cab forward in this universe, his bunker was rebuilt to allow him to carry more coal, as he would need the extra space doing coal runs up to Ulfstead. Fact 4. I've talked about the railway's coaching stock previously, but never given a timeline of when which coaches were used. So here's the history of the NWR's coaching stock. The 1907 stock, known as the old coaches, were originally built for the Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway before it became a part of the NWR. These were later superseded by the 1915 stock, aka the tan coaches, which had 4-wheeler, 6-wheeler, and bogie variants. These are the stock Annie and Clarabelle are a part of. Those were replaced by the 1925 stock, the orange coaches, demoting the tan coaches to local and branch line workings. They were the first corridor coaches on the NWR, and one was turned into a buffet coach for the Wild Nor'Wester. They are distinguishable from the other stock by their large bay windows. 1925 was the year the Wild Nor'Wester returned to its green and cream scheme, after a brief stint of it just being tan. These lasted on express services until 1935, when they were replaced by second-hand Monsell coaches. Monsell, bought off of the Southern Railway. Some of them can still be seen on expresses today. 1951 was when Crovan's Gate's coaching division began producing BR Mark I's for both Sodor and the rest of the BR network. Construction of Mark I's continued until 1963, the same year the NWR split from BR. After the split, Crovan's Gate went back to design their own coaches, but given how much of a surplus they now had, these designs didn't come to fruition until the late 70s. The 75 stock are what we see during Christopher Rogers' tenure, designated by the darker shade of brown. Despite outward appearances, the interior of these have all the creature comforts of modern coaches, and they are typically used on the services that go off the NWR's network. Crovan's Gate has stuck with this design whenever new coaches are needed, refining it over the years to keep up with the demands of a modern passenger. Fact 5. If you were to ever venture to the harbor of Rendam, you'd find several industries set up there, far more than just a harbor. There's the headquarters of Sodor Salt, the primary salt distribution company on the island. Why do you think we see so many salt vans on the railway? Another industry you can find here is a cycling plant, which was recently built in the 90s. It's staffed by a crane called Jack and an engine called Lord Stinker. He's a rather nice fellow and gets on well with Scruff, as scrunching is essentially recycling but using only metal. And now for the questions. A random Thomas fan asks, do any of the Skarloey engines have different classes to separate them from the Tallyclin? How many non-Tallyclin engines are on the SKR? A very good question. The Skarloey engines which have Tallyclin counterparts have mostly remained unchanged. That is, apart from Ivo Hugh. Like Tom Roll, he was specially designed for his railway, and is thus much bigger. For those unaware, the Skarloey is actually a lot longer than the Tallyclin. The amount of engines without tally pin counterparts is much bigger. The obvious ones are Duke and Freddy, but there's also Smudger, who's a modified Baldwin 1012D, rescued from the old Mid-Sodor shed where he was left to rot. Another is Oakland, an Irish steam tractor who works at the Gleelowy quarry. There will be more than that, I just haven't finalized the SKR roster yet. On the subject of the SKR, Jack Kaufman asks, does Duncan know who George Carlin is? Yes indeed. Duncan learned about him when some of the workmen were watching one of his acts on the TV in the sheds. Needless to say, Duncan had become a huge fan instantly. Later on in the 80s, he learned that Carlin was narrating the television series. He was opposed to the idea at first, but after watching a few episodes, he grew not only to love his narration, but the show as a whole. He was very pleased when the episode starring himself came out, so much in fact he decided to be painted yellow to match his TV series appearance. Duncan was absolutely distraught when Carlin passed, but decided to focus on appreciate the joy and laughter he brought into the world. To this day, a response to a fan letter Duncan sent to George Carlin hangs in the sheds in his honor. NW Guy 475 asks, does the NWR have a wartime black livery? Yep. It consists of black, with 2 boiler bands on each end of the boiler and lining on the side tanks, cab sides, and tender sides. The lining corresponds with the livery the engine wore pre-1939. The number is placed on the cab side, and the letters NW are on either side of the tanks or the side of the tender. Tass asks, who works at the various docks and harbors of Sodor? A lot of engines. Knapford Harbor was at one point home to over a dozen industrial engines. Most of those companies have scaled back production, but there's still half a dozen engines working there. The ones you would know are Salty and Porter. Moving southwest, Brendam is staffed by a little engine called Audrey, purchased in 1904 and working there ever since. She's essentially Bill and Ben's auntie. Vickerstown Harbor is run by Paxson and Sydney, who you've probably heard of. Like Knapford, there used to be more industrial engines at the harbor, but most of them are gone now. YJ Play asks, is Spencer in your AU, and if so, what is his livery and backstory? Spencer is indeed here. Under the LNER, he was called King Fisher. His life was relatively uneventful until the 60s. Let's just say Spencer was rather aggressive in his obsession to be preserved, much like the rest of the A4s, I might add. He pulled the last passenger train headed by an A4 in 1966, and was withdrawn thereafter. Fortunately for him, the Duke and Duchess of Boxford would purchase him from BR a few years later, as part of their private collection of air railway antiques. He would be renamed Spencer after the Duke's father, and would be repainted into the Silver Jubilee livery, despite him not actually wearing it in service. He was placed on rail services which would go around the country. Gordon, Emily, and the rest of the LNR engines don't like him in the slightest. When he stays overnight at Knapford, you can be sure that no engine will be sleeping that night. But that's another story. Wait, don't click off the video yet. Since you've watched all the way to the end, how about I show you a little something I'm working on? Hopefully it'll be done by the end of the month. Until then, this is EdwardsDayOut, signing off.